Welcome back to another Murderous Minds Monday, where we cover the most notorious and sick and twisted serial killers ever. This week we are going to be covering the story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Strangler, who terrorized Wichita, Kansas in the 1970s and 1990s until his subsequent downfall in 2004. Today we're going to cover the case of the crimes that he committed, the murders that he committed, and his subsequent downfall, and how a mistake that he made led to his own arrest. So if you want to learn more and you want to know about the BTK Strangler, then today we are going to cover that story. Let's get on with this. Dennis Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas on the 9th of March 1945, and he was actually raised in Wichita, and he was the oldest of 4 siblings. Although he had a normal childhood, he did feel that he was sort of ignored by his mother and didn't get the attention that he thought he deserved from her. And even though he had a normal childhood, it is said that he actually masked his sort of evil tendencies, where he would strangle stray animals and hang them from trees, but no one realised this was happening. It's also said that he found arousal from this, and when he hit puberty he was already dreaming of tying up girls and having sex with them, which is such a, I don't know, such a strange thing to fantasize about at such an early age. He said that his fantasies were almost like a picture show, like he could vividly imagine doing this stuff to these women or these girls. And his favourite girl to make these fantasies about was actually one of the Mouseketeers from Mickey's Mouse Club. It was an actress called Anita Finchillo, and she was on the show in the 1950s, so obviously when Rader was quite young. And he would fantasize about tying her up and having sex with her, which very disturbing thing to think about at that age. The only activities that Dennis actually participated in when he was younger is that he went to Boy Scouts, and he did things with the Lutheran church that he was part of. And also while he was in Boy Scouts, obviously they were taught how to tie knots. So this is where he learned all the knots that he would use in his future murders. Also, when he was younger, he was introduced to the serial killer Harvey Glattman in a magazine that he found. And this serial killer killed his victims with rope. And that is where Rader began hanging stray animals and killing them, when he learned about Harvey's murderous ways and how he killed his victims. And he also imagined himself as being one of these elite serial killers when he was older. So already he's having that feeling of being like infamous and wanting to be like the serial killer Harvey Glattman. In 1963 he graduated Wichita High School, and then he worked at the local grocery store, and in the summer of 1966, at the age of 21, he ended up going into the US Air Force. And it's said that he probably enrolled in the US Air Force actually to avoid going into the Vietnam War, which was going on at the time. However, while he was in the Air Force, he would actually peek through people's windows and stalk women. And he would also break into their homes and steal their underwear, which is disgusting. Less than a year after returning from the US Air Force, on the 22nd of May 1971, he married a young woman called Paula Dietz, and they went on to actually have 2 children. So he had a daughter named Carrie and a son named Brian. And in July of 1973 he found employment with Cessna, which was a small aircraft manufacturer. And he was a very, very smart man with a very high IQ. And so in the fall of 1973 he actually started to work towards getting his bachelor's degree at Wichita State University, and he also dreamed of becoming a police officer. So very similar to last week's case with the Hillside Strangler, where Kenneth Bianchi wanted to become a police officer and would try with all his might to do that. Dennis Rader wanted to become a police officer as well. However, in late 1973, Rader was actually let go from Cessna, and he suddenly found himself unemployed and in a bad mental state. So unhappy and with lots of free times in his hand, he ended up slipping back into his dark fantasies, and these fantasies got worse. So at the time, with all this spare time in his hands, he wanted to strangle women with his bare hands. He wasn't even interested in the rope anymore. He just wanted to strangle these women. And he was obsessed with pornography and would just daydream a lot, imagining these dark fantasies that he's been having since he was a child. He also began cross-dressing as a woman and would spy on women through their windows, and he would masturbate with ropes tied around his arms and around his neck. And he also had a nickname for his penis at the time. His nickname for his penis was Sparky. Don't know why it was called Sparky. Very weird. Couldn't find out any more information about that. Didn't really want to know any more information about that, to be honest. However, to the public, some people in his area or in the town thought he was a very polite and family man. However, some people did find him very obsessive and strange. So he kind of portrayed these two personas to people. He also began to enjoy an activity called trolling. This meant driving and walking around certain neighborhoods and school campuses with young women or young girls present. And he would just observe them and lust over them, which is, or it just makes me feel so uncomfortable. He also stalked women as they shopped alone in grocery stores, and he also had fantasies of hiding out in their back seats and kidnapping them at gunpoint. And then he would focus on a good prospect and then enter into the home and fantasize about bondage, sex and murder. So his dark fantasies are really starting to evolve at this point. So by 1974, Dennis was compelled to actually act on these fantasies. He trained himself on how to avoid detection, and he learned knots and nooses. He was ready to attack his first victim. Where Rader lived, there was a new Latino family who had recently moved in. These were the Otero family. Rader noticed Julia Otero, who was the 34-year-old mother of the family, and he would lust over her, and also her 11-year-old daughter Josephine. They were the two targets that he had noticed in the family. It's said that he had a thing for Latinas, and he admired their beautiful brown skin and dark hair. He stalked Julia and Josephine for weeks to learn their routine and to figure out the best point to do his attack. Based on what he learned from the surveillance that he did over those weeks, he went to the Otero house, entered the backyard and cut their telephone lines. He then broke into their house. Despite his careful planning, things did not go how Dennis expected them to. So he discovered in the house that in addition to the two victims that he planned to attack that day, Julia's husband Joe, aged 38, and the son of the couple, Joey, who was 9, were also in the home at the time. However, the Otero's 3 other children were not at home when Dennis entered. However, Dennis was undeterred by this and just changed his plan, and somehow he was able to control all 4 of these people. I'm guessing because it was such a surprise attack, they didn't know what was going on. He also had a gun on him at this point. So he was using the gun to control the Otero family. He then told them the story that he was a criminal and that he was a wanted man and he was on the run, which I don't know why he used that story. I think it's because then they kind of thought, oh, he's just here to steal some stuff. He's just trying to get away, and it kind of calmed them down a little bit. He also convinced the Otero family that he meant them no harm. By doing that, he was able to get them all tied up without any incident, so no one fought back at that time. However, everything went a bit chaotic and changed for the worse when Dennis put a bag over 9-year-old Joey's head. He was also going to become a mass murderer by murdering the 4 people in this family. So he started off with the 2 boys. He killed the father Joe and the 9-year-old son Joey. As he's doing this, Julia is begging Dennis to stop this attack. However, before she could say too much, Dennis strangled her to death as well. Then he moved on to his real target, which was 11-year-old Josephine Otero, and he forced her to go down to the basement of the property. He then hung Josephine from a sewer pipe, and later on he was asked why he did this, and he stated that he was just interested in watching her die. However, even though he only meant to target Julia and Josephine, this was a really well orchestrated plan for a mass murder of 4 people. And it turned out that the father, Joe, was actually a former boxer. Julia actually practiced jiu-jitsu. So the crime actually had the hallmark of a military operation. Obviously, he was in the US Air Force, so that's possible. However, when the police found the bodies of the Otero family, there were signs of obviously sex and bondage, but the police haven't discussed these details further with the public, obviously, because they're not nice details to discuss and release to the public. However, this is just the beginning of Rader's killing career. The Otero family were actually discovered by their 15-year-old son Charlie, who came home from school and discovered the deceased bodies of his 4 family members, which must have been horrendous. I can't even imagine the scene. Just seeing all your mother, father, and your 2 younger siblings all dead in the property. Yeah. Then on the 4th of April 1974, Dennis broke into the home of Catherine Bright, and he waited for her to return to her house. However, she returned home with her 19-year-old brother Kevin, which he wasn't expecting. So again, this is not going how Dennis planned. There's another person involved in this equation again. When they both entered the property, Dennis pulled a handgun on them, and he used the same excuse that he used with the Oteros, that he was a wanted man and that he meant them no harm. He said that he just needed a car to get away and hide or run away, and then he had Kevin Bright, so Catherine's brother, tie her up, and then Dennis tied Kevin to the bedposts in the bedroom. He then moved Catherine into another room, and he returned to Kevin to strangle him. However, Kevin had managed to actually loosen the ties that were tying him to the bed, and he started to struggle with Dennis. Dennis then pulled out his handgun and shot Kevin, and he assumed he'd killed him, so he went back into Catherine. However, she'd also managed to untie herself, since the ties that Dennis had tied weren't very good, and there was a massive struggle that happens between Dennis and Catherine. When he thought he was actually overpowering Catherine, he heard Kevin again in the other room, and so returned to try and re-strangle him, and the struggle started again between him and Kevin. Kevin tried to get hold of one of the 2 handguns that Dennis had on him, and he almost succeeded, but Dennis shot him in the head and believed that Dennis was good, dead for good this time, so returned again to Catherine. However, Catherine struggled with him again, and so he took a knife and stabbed her under the ribs several times. At the time that he was attacking Catherine with the knife, he actually heard Kevin escape. Kevin had actually survived, and he heard the front door open and Kevin ran out. With Catherine dead, he grabbed the keys to the pickup truck that was out the front and tried to leave the property. However, he wasn't able to access the truck, so he just ran away from the property. Later, the police would actually find semen at the scene when they discovered Catherine's body, but due to DNA testing being very limited in 1974, it was collected, but nothing could be done with it at the time. So Dennis made first contact as the BTK Strangler in October of 1974, when he sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle, and it was to their secret witness program. In the letter, he confessed to the murders of Joseph, Julia, Joe, and Josephine Otero, and warned that the monster was still on the rampage. The letter was obviously immediately given to the police, and despite several appeals for the letter writer to come forward or make contact again, they received nothing. So this secret witness program that Dennis wrote to was a program set up by the newspaper that meant a person with information regarding a crime, they could pass the information to the police through the newspaper without giving out their identity. They knew the letter was from the murderer of the Otero family, as there was information in the letter that only the killer would know. Dennis has claimed that the selection of his next victim, Shirley Vian Relford, on the 17th of March 1977 was actually completely random, which is, I think that's the scariest thing about all of this, is that most of his victims ended up just being random people. There was no rhyme or reason to the attacks. He actually said that he was targeting someone across the street from Shirley. These people were called the Dillons. However, he drove over to the Dillons' house and parked up out the front, and he watched the residents, but nothing happened. So he walked over to the residents and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. However, Dennis was ready to kill someone, so he went around the neighborhood until he met a young boy. This was Shelley Relford's son, Steve, and he just asked him to look at some photos that he had. I don't know why. It was a very random thing to do. He then went to some other addresses and let the young boy go. However, he didn't get any answers at these addresses, so he went to the house where he saw Shirley Relford's son go to. He then knocked on the door of the residence, and Shirley's 5-year-old son answered. Dennis then stated that he was actually a private detective and was working in the area, and he then showed the same pictures that he showed to him before, and then forced his way into the property past Shirley's 5-year-old son. He then found Shirley in the property and said to her that he was having sexual fantasies and that he was going to tie her up and maybe the kids too. And obviously Shirley was extremely nervous and caught by surprise at this. He then explained to Shirley the previous crimes that he had committed, and he went into such detail that Shirley actually threw up from the facts that he had given her. He then took her to the bedroom and tied her to her bed, and then he tied the kids up and put them in the bathroom, and they all started crying at this point, obviously. So he shut the door to the bathroom so that they couldn't leave. He apparently put some toys and blankets in there just to keep the kids comfortable, which seems very strange. He then proceeded to tie Shirley up again, and she was sick again and threw up. He got her a glass of water and comforted her a little bit, and then went ahead and tied her up again and put a bag over her head before strangling her. He stated that at this time the children were making a lot of noise in the bathroom, and the phone rang, and he had been told by the children that their neighbour was actually going to check in on them that day since Shirley wasn't feeling 100%. And at that moment, Dennis put his tape cords and other items back in his hit case, like hit briefcase. He collected his hit kit, and he went back to the car that he had parked at the Dillons' lot. Again, police found semen at the house when they discovered Shirley's body. Dennis then started stalking his next victim just a little while before he attacked her on the 8th of December 1977. He dropped by her house once and checked her mail to actually find out the name of this victim. And his next victim's name was Nancy Fox, and she was his PJ project. I don't know what that means, but he had spotted her once while cruising around her area, and Nancy actually worked at a jewellery store which Dennis visited, and it was called Hellsberg's. He surveyed her and sized her up, and the more he knew about her, the more comfortable he felt about his situation and how it was all going to turn out. He then selected a night he thought would work best and worked out the way that he was going to do this. He didn't like to try and charm or manhandle the women, so he just simply packed 2 handguns, a knife, and a homemade brass knuckle duster, and he cut the phone lines again to Nancy's property. Dennis knew the time that Nancy usually returned home from work, so after he knew no one else was home, he then broke into the back of her home and he waited for her in the kitchen. When she entered the property, Dennis then confronted her and told her that he had a problem of a sexual nature and that he wanted to just tie her up and rape her. Nancy obviously got really upset at this, and for some reason Dennis actually let her smoke a cigarette and they just stood there chatting. Very weird. He then let her get undressed in the bathroom and he got undressed in the bedroom, and he made her get on the bed and he got on top of her. He then reached over, grabbed his belt and strangled her. He then took the belt off from around her neck, let her regain consciousness. He would strangle her again. He then let her regain consciousness again and actually whispered to her that he was wanted for the murders of the Otero family and other murders, and that she was going to be his next victim. Which, could you imagine the pure fear? But that's what Dennis liked. He liked to see that fear in them. She then began to really struggle after hearing this information, obviously, and so he strangled her again. And after she passed away, he was so aroused he masturbated over her. Disgusting. He then took some of her personal items as trophies for this murder and cleaned up any evidence at the scene and returned to his car, which he had parked several blocks away. Then on the 31st of January 1978, the Wichita Eagle received an index card imprinted with a poem which began, "Shirley locks, wilt thou be mine?" However, the mail clerk that found the letter was unaware of the connection, or the possible connection, to the murder of Shirley Vian, and believed it to be a Valentine's Day note because it was getting close to Valentine's Day, and so he just forwarded it to the paper's classified ads. At this time of these murders being committed, Dennis is actually working for an ADT security firm, which is crazy, and he would install security systems for families that were actually scared of being attacked by the BTK Strangler. So these families are fearful that the BTK Strangler is going to target them next, not knowing that the BTK Strangler is actually installing their home security systems. Also, due to a lack of response from the poem that Dennis sent into the Wichita Eagle on the 31st of January, he was angered and sent a more direct message to a TV station called Cake TV. And this one said, "How many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention?" And due to his ego, obviously he's a very egotistical man, he actually reeled off some nicknames that they could use for him. Some of these nicknames included the BTK Strangler. He also said, what about the Wichita Hangman? Also the Asphyxiator. So the police chief at the time, after receiving this letter, called a news conference and revealed the presence of the BTK Strangler. So he now has a name and he's getting the attention he wants. They also warned everyone that he had the potential to strike again and that they didn't think his murderous rampage was over. On the 28th of April 1979, he found his next victim and he waited for her. It was a 63-year-old woman named Anna Williams. He waited for her to return home. However, he gave up because she was taking too long. He wasn't interested in waiting around. She was actually only made aware of her brush with death, like with the BTK killer, when she received several of her personal items in the post, along with a poem titled "Oh My Anna, Why Didn't You Appear?" less than 2 months after he had targeted her. So she had a very lucky escape by actually taking too long to return home. On the 14th of August 1979, authors received the recording of the BTK's phone call from December 1977 to seek help from the public, where he had reported the death of Nancy Fox to the police. Tips came pouring in of people who thought they recognised the voice of the killer. However, there was no credible information that was received, and so no further investigation could be done on the phone call. A task force was then put together by the police, which was dedicated to finding the identity and capturing the BTK killer. This task force, for some reason, was called Ghostbusters. Not too sure why, and it included a young officer called Ken Ladwer, would actually spearhead later efforts to track down Dennis. After his attempt with Anna, he actually took a massive massive cool down period. However, his next victim was 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, who actually just lived down the street from him, and they were neighbours. Due to the close proximity with Maureen, obviously it made it easier to stalk his victim and figure out her daily activities. And she would actually work in the yard quite often, and Dennis would go over to her and say hello as he walked by. So he had interaction with this next victim quite a bit. On the night of Maureen's murder, Dennis broke into her property and waited for her to return home. However, again, he hadn't accounted for her to not be alone when she returned home, and she actually returned home from an evening of bingo with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend then left the house about an hour later, and Rader waited until the early hours of the morning, so at this point Maureen is asleep. He then snuck into her bedroom and turned on the bathroom light, which obviously alerted Maureen, and she woke up startled. He immediately jumped on her bed and strangled her. After he strangled her, he was still in his sexual fantasy, and he went ahead and stripped her body. He then placed a blanket on her and went through her purse and all her personal belongings in the house. While he was going through his belongings, he actually worked out how he was going to get out of this situation. He moved Maureen's body to the trunk of her car and drove the car to the Christ Lutheran church that he was actually the president at. So he's still involved in the church even since being a young boy. He then took pictures of her in the church, and then he put her in the church basement, placed her in different sexual positions and different forms of bondage, took pictures and then moved her back to the trunk of her car. He then disposed of her body in a ditch he found, and he hid her body under brush with some trees and other things covering her. Her body was only discovered 8 days later, but the police failed to connect her murder to the BTK Strangler. Dennis's next project, he called his victims projects, was 28-year-old mother of two, Vicky Virgil. He planned to tell Vicky that he was a telephone repairman as a ruse to actually enter the house. And due to being a telephone repairman, he was actually able to turn up to the property in his kill or his hit clothes, because they looked like workman's clothes, so the sort of stuff that a telephone repairman would use. He also had a telephone man hat, I'm guessing that's what it said, and a briefcase, which was obviously his hit kit. It was just a briefcase to her at the time. As he approached Vicky's house, she was an avid piano player, and he could hear her playing the piano in the property. He then knocked on the door and asked if he could go in and just check her telephone lines inside, which obviously you would. You'd be like, oh yeah, that's fine, if you think that it's a telephone repairman that's come around to fix something in your property, which makes me very nervous for anyone that comes around to fix anything in this flat. I don't think I'm going to let them in, or I'm at least going to tell Callum that someone's here. He then entered the property, found where the phone line was, and pretended to check the phone. However, when Vicky turned her back, he pulled the gun on her and told Vicky to go back into her bedroom. He then proceeded to tie her up, and he used fabric that he actually found in her bedroom to do this. However, they came loose and she tried to fight Dennis off. He then grabbed one of her stockings that he found and strangled her. When he thought she was dead, he rearranged her clothes and took several pictures of her. So now he's also getting into taking pictures of his victims a lot more. Dennis then made a hasty retreat out of Vicky's property, as she had actually mentioned during her attack that her husband was going to be home soon. When her husband came home, all the windows and the doors in the back of the property were open, and he found his son, his 5-year-old son, sitting on the sofa alone. He found Vicky in the bedroom. Although she was fatally injured by her injury, she wasn't dead yet, and her husband Bill raced her to the hospital, where she died later on due to her injuries. However, the BTK killer wasn't a suspect in this case. Bill was the primary suspect for the murder of Vicky, and it wasn't linked to the BTK killer until later on. Dennis found his next victim, 62-year-old Dolores Davies, on the 19th of January 1991. So he's had a massive cool down period at this point. It's been about 15 years since his last murder, which was Vicky. And instead of just breaking into the property like he had done, He used a more noisy method for some reason and threw a breeze block through her window, which obviously startled 62-year-old Dolores Davis. She left her bedroom thinking that a car had somehow hit her property. However, she found Dennis, and Dennis used the same excuse that he'd used with a lot of his victims and said that he was a wanted man. He said that he just needed some food, a car, so he took the keys to Dolores's car and he went around the house getting food, obviously just making a lot of noise. But he was actually working out where her car was in reference to the property and how he was actually going to escape after he had killed Dolores. He then took Dolores back to her bedroom where he tied her up and went on to strangle her to death. He then proceeded to take some of her personal items from the property, and Dolores's body was put into a blanket, and then he dragged her to the trunk of her car, again like Marine. However, due to other commitments, because at this time Dennis is working, he's got 2 kids at home, and he's also trying to complete his studies. Due to other commitments that he had, he was rushing around and actually left one of his guns at the scene of the crime. So once he had Dolores in the car, he then had to go back into the property, retrieve his guns, and then drive her away. And he dumped her body under a bridge. And after the death of Dolores, Dennis seemed to be quite preoccupied with his daily life. The BTK Strangler just dropped off the radar. He no longer committed crimes, and it seemed like he'd disappeared. When Dennis was eventually caught, doctors actually stated that he was quite a established and accomplished psychopath, as he was able to live these 2 separate lives and keep them completely separate. He was a loving family man with his 2 kids at home. He had a successful business, and he was also had his alter ego of the BTK killer, which is insane. In January of 2004, so 30 years after the first murders that Dennis committed of the Otero family, the Wichita Eagle for some reason ran an article recalling the terror of the BTK killer and suggested that the memory of the BTK killer had actually faded from memory at that time. And this angered Dennis because he wanted to be infamous. It revived his deadly ego of the BTK killer. On the 19th of March 2004, the Wichita Eagle received an envelope from Bill Thomas Killman, BTK, and it contained a copy of Vicky's missing driving license, photos of her body, and the BTK's distinctive signature. The chilling message that was received in the envelope linked the BTK killer to the death of Vicky, which obviously her husband Bill was being framed for, or he was a prime suspect for. And it also showed that the BTK killer was very much alive and well. On the 5th of May 2004, Dennis also sent a letter to Cake TV again, and this included a phony ID card and chapter titles for a BT killer biography, which again plays into his egotistical thoughts. It also contained a find the word grid, spelling out clues like cruel and fantasies, and puzzle enthusiasts a few years later would actually inspect this puzzle and realise that the letters R-A-D-E-R were included in the puzzle, and they were grouped around the number 6220, which was the author's secret address. So he put loads of clues in these puzzles as well. Over a year later, on the 13th of December 2005, Dennis left more messages in various public places. A man walked through Wichita Murdoch Park, and he stumbled across a rubbish bag which contained Nancy Fox's driving license and a Barbie doll with a hood over her head. So on the 25th of January 2005, the police acted on the information that they'd received in the letter that was sent to Cake TV, and they found a cereal box on the roadside. In the box, it contained a graphic description of the BTK's first murders and another doll fashioned in a death position, so tied up with hands behind their back and strangled. Another section of the postcard was looked into, and it took the police to the local Home Depot store. And after poking around the store, the investigators learned that one of the employees had actually found a cereal box in the bed of their truck. The box was located in the rubbish, and in the box was a message from Dennis that stated that if he communicated through a floppy disk, could it be traced and tracked back to him, and if it couldn't, that the police were to put an article in the newspaper which said, "Rex, it will be okay." So on the 28th of January 2005, the police ran the classified ad in the Wichita Eagle, and it just read, "Rex, it will be okay," like he had asked. And it also contained the PO box that he could send the floppy disk to. A floppy disk was later received on the 16th of February 2005. It was relayed to a cyber cop called Randy Stone, who uncovered the BTK's message about checking an index card for more information. There was also hidden metadata found on the floppy disk. It showed the police that this floppy disk had been used by someone called Dennis at the Christ Lutheran Church and at a Park City library. So within seconds, they ran a search on the Christ Lutheran Church and found that the name of the president was none other than Dennis Rader. So although they had told him that he could communicate without being tracked, they lied, obviously, to get the information that they needed for the killer. That was the first break that they had ever had in the identity of the BTK killer. Armed with the BTK killer's semen and DNA evidence that they'd had from the crime scenes, they also found out who Dennis Rader's daughter was. And Dennis's daughter Carrie had actually been into a local hospital recently for a pap smear, and the police obtained the sample of her DNA from this. And when they completed testing, it came back as a match to the BTK killer, which then obviously linked Dennis Rader to the killings committed by the BTK. So on February 25th, 2005, Dennis was heading home for lunch with his wife when he was pulled over by a line of police and put into handcuffs and taken into custody. After he was confronted with the DNA evidence that they had, Dennis confessed to the murders. He had no choice. They had the evidence there. But he enjoyed bonding with the police and playing with them. However, he was very upset that they had lied to him about contacting them with the floppy disk. And the following day, the police announced to the public that they had the BTK killer in custody. And the audience in attendance at the public announcement applauded at the knowledge of this. There was a scheduled hearing on April 19th, 2005, and it ended after just a few short minutes as the defence acknowledged that the state possessed enough evidence to send the case to trial, and 2 weeks later, a silent Rader entered a not guilty plea, even with the evidence that they had. However, when it came to the trial on the 27th of June 2005, Dennis Rader pled guilty again, and he pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He described explicit details of the murders that he had committed, and he explained how exactly he stalked his victims and chose the people that he committed the murders to. His lawyer later stated that they went with the guilty plea as they didn't have legal standing to go for the insanity plea, which they were planning on doing. The sentencing hearing lasted just 2 days, and it featured testimonies from the investigators who were working on the case, emotional pleas from the victims' families, and an apology from Dennis, hoping that the families would one day forgive him, which I wouldn't blame them if they never did. As Dennis had actually committed his first murder before Kansas reinstated the death penalty in 1994, he received 10 consecutive life sentences for the 10 murders, and he was sentenced to serve a minimum term of 175 years without the possibility of parole. So he will spend the rest of his life in prison, as he should. His daughter also later published a book on the 29th of January 2019, and the title of the book was A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Hope, Love and Overcoming. And the book described her relationship with her father and how she overcame the horror of finding out the crimes that he had committed. So his family say that they never knew the crimes that he had committed at the time. Since his incarceration, Dennis has been possibly linked to 2 further murders, and the police announced this on the 5th of September 2024, so just last year. It is stated that Dennis had depicted a picture of a woman in 2005, and the woman had been bound and gagged in a barn, and they believed her to be from southeast Kansas, and she disappeared in 1991. However, this is still under investigation, but it is possible he committed more than the 10 murders. So Dennis is currently serving his 175 years in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, and he also refuses or continues to refuse to cooperate with investigations that are being completed by the police, even with immunity deals being offered, so they can't actually add any further lengths to his sentence, but he's refusing to help them anyway. So that is the end of today's case about Dennis Rader, the BTK Strangler. However, we have to acknowledge the victims of this case. They include Joseph Otero Sr., who was 38 years old, Julia Maria Otero, who was just 33 years old, Joseph Otero Jr., or Joey, who was 9 years old, Josephine Otero, who was 11 years old, Catherine Bright, who was only 21 years old, Shirley Relford, who was 25 years old, Nancy Fox, who was 25 years old, Maureen Hedge, who was 53 years old, Vicky Weggery, who was 28 years old, and Dolores Davis, who was just 62 years old. These are the 10 victims that he has been convicted of murdering. There are possibly more, and it's just a horrific case. And I hope the families out there are doing okay. And I'm glad that Dennis is where he should be and is serving his time for these murders. Let me know down below what you think of this case. I think it's a bit creepy that he didn't have he didn't just focus on like the younger women, he just changed up who he was going to murder. It was kind of sporadic. He planned to kill one person and would quickly change his mind like that, which just terrifies me. But let me know what you think down below. Let me know any other cases that you want me to cover in the future. I have quite a few that I'm thinking of covering. And yeah, be careful who you trust out there, guys, and who you let into your property. I hope you are all safe and well, and I will see you next Monday for another Murderous Minds Monday on another serial killer. Bye!